So welcome everybody. I am super excited to welcome you all and our esteemed panel of absolute heavyweights to this conversation on barriers to Black academia, discussions of the barriers of representation, experience and funding in the UK. So we're going to be here for about 2 hours, including 30 minutes for Q&A. So I really invite you all to get those questions ready and get them into the Q&A box. Please don't put them in the chat because they will likely get missed. So please use the Q&A box for questions and please keep them kind and appropriate. We're going to have a lot of people discussing their personal experiences, and even though they are just faces on a screen, they've obviously been through a lot to be here with us today. So keep them kind, keep them cute, keep them grandma acceptable. That would be delightful. Also, because today is going to be recorded, so that will be edited and then made available on the CSIS webpage on the University of Liverpool website. And to that end, you can also tweet about the event, good things only, using @CSIS Slavery and the hashtag Black Academia UK. Sound good? Amazing stuff. So this symposium has been developed by two absolute angels of the academic world, Derby Research Fellow Dr. Leona Vaughan and Malik Nasir of Forward Press for the Centre for Studying International Slavery, which is a collaboration between the University of Liverpool and National Museums Liverpool. It's a series of online panel discussions about the absence and the effects of that absence of Black UK academics in this area of teaching and research. And the Centre for International Slavery Study will be developing a report and recommendations from this series of events in advance of convening a roundtable, lifting the barriers to UK Black academia for higher education institutions and policymakers on the 25th of March 2022. So put that in your diaries now. If you haven't already checked it out, the symposium opened on Slavery Remembrance Day with a keynote lecture by Sir Professor Hilary Beckles, Vice-Chancellor of the University of West Indies, Chair of the CARICOM Reparations Commission, and expert advisor to the United Nations Futures of Higher Education report. This is now available on the website. I'm going to see if maybe behind the scenes, someone can drop the link and make sure that's repeated in the chat for people to access. Do save it for later because it is a really, really, really good watch. And so Hilary covers a number of, it's so interesting, it's so fascinating. And for me as a scholar of Jamaican descent, I felt really connected to some particular parts of history and my own culture and heritage that I hadn't known about before, but I'm sure it's equally as enlightening for a whole range of people. And some of the things that we're going to be discussing from that keynote and today is that across all disciplines, there is an unacceptably low number of Black scholars in the UK higher education sector. That's just a fact, but particularly at professor level and especially women. So it is amazing that we've got such a blended and diverse panel here today. In history, where the majority of research into the transatlantic traffic in enslaved Africans is situated, Black historians make up fewer than 1% of UK university-based staff, and only 11% of undergraduates are Black and minority ethnic. And Leading Roots, of whom we have Paulette Williams here with us today, found that just 1.2% of the 19,868 PhD studentships awarded by all UKRI research councils went to Black or Black mixed students, and only 30 of those were from a Black Caribbean background, which is mental. And I think I definitely saw a project where I think the 30 Black Caribbean people were trying to find each other, which is insane. And as the chair of this conversation, all of this is very close to my heart. I have recently returned to academia after a 10-year, giving away my age now, 10-year gap, and I'm studying African traditional religions and their anti-slavery resistance at the University of Liverpool. I am definitely thinking about a PhD, and funding is a question for that. So I hope that slightly more than 30 will get through, but it's mad to think that I would, in contemporary times, I could be one of I could be one plus 29 others. I mean, that's not even going to sell out some venues. Come on now. So we can do a bit better. We can do a bit better than that. When I'm not studying and researching, I am the founder of House of Sweet Waters, where I help people start businesses based on what they love, and so that they can live their identity, purpose, and passions more fully in this world. These two things convene from my own personal experience, interest, and studies in African traditional religions and in ritual. And I also do some advisory work on modern slavery, where the slavery has involved ritualistic processes, even though enslavement as a whole is a ritual, and doing advisory work supporting survivor rehabilitation. So that's a little bit about me, but I am the least interesting person that we have here today. So I'm going to introduce the esteemed panel, and then we are going to get into some questions. Does that sound good? Great. Okay, so first, I want to welcome to the Zoom screen, Malik Al-Nasir. Malik Al-Nasir is a PhD student at the Faculty of History at the University of Cambridge, St. Catherine's College. Malik is from a social sciences background, and having acquired a PG at the University of Liverpool in applied social research, developed a pilot think tank, the Social Enterprise Research Initiative, in conjunction with the Globalization and Social Exclusion Unit. He went on to do an MA in New Media Production at Liverpool John Moores University, and is now doing a PhD at Cambridge based on his own genealogical research into his family connections back through slavery. His research has appeared in both national and international press, and Malik has a 2-book deal with the William Collins imprint of publisher HarperCollins. So welcome, Malik.
Hi, thank you very much, Mara. And can I thank everybody else, the participants and the panelists who've come through today. But I would really like to thank Dr. Leona Vaughan, who, when I first presented the idea of having a symposium around the barriers that Black academics face, she was the first one before anyone else to say, I will fund this if I have to. And she got right behind it because of the significance of this. And I think myself and Leona were very aware of Paulette's report with Leading Roots and the Broken Pipeline. And I think what Paulette gave us was the evidential basis, if you like, to create a rationale for this symposium today. So thank you, Paulette, particularly for doing that seminal research that you did, which gave us the fuel that we needed, if you like, to drive this symposium. Apologies if Peppa Pig comes on in the background here. I'm actually at a motorway stop at the moment on my way back from Birmingham, so I had to log on and do this. So if the little machine comes on in the background, it's not, you know, it's not part of the soundtrack. It just happens to be where I am at the moment. But I do appreciate everybody taking the time to come through. Why I initially conceived the idea of having a symposium was because of the barriers that I personally faced. So I had grown up in the local authority care system, where we suffered from a range of things. One was not having a normal structural, familial structure behind us to nurture us and nurture our potential. We were being, if you like, raised by the state, and the state did anything but nurture us. It was the complete antitheses of nurturing. And then when you factor into all of that, the racial dimensions as well, growing up in the 70s, Liverpool, very racial, sort of polarized society. We faced multiple barriers. We had Black Sambo in the Jungle being played in school assemblies. Mm-hmm. We had, Enid Blyton's 10 Little Nigger Boys, on the menu, or Catherine Cookson or whoever it was who wrote that. We had all of these things, gollywogs on the jam jars, all of these negative images of ourselves during our formative years. And to me, this is where the pipeline begins, in the schools. And then you go through to the colleges, and you're trying to get ahead in the college, and you don't see people who look like you, who are the teachers. And then you move, if you try to get to the universities, and then you've got to encounter, substantive debt. And when you get to the postgraduate level and you're looking for the opportunities to be able to get funded to do a PhD or something, they only want people who've done first class honours degree or a master's with distinction. If your starting point is subterranean, you know, just trying to get up to the level, and you're already 50 grand in debt by the time you get there. And now they're telling you it's going to be another 75 grand before you can get to the stage of being in a position to fund yourself through a PhD, because you only got a 2-1 or a 2-2 and you didn't get a first class honours degree. But yet somebody who went to Eton or Harrow, you know, or Merchant Taylors or one of these other places, who was totally nurtured, has no student debt, whose daddy's a stockbroker, you know, there's Peppa Pig, sorry about that. Whose daddy's a stockbroker, you know what I mean? Doesn't need the money, but can get the full funding because they can tick those boxes, because they never had to do anything but sit down and study. They weren't grappling with gollywogs on jam jars. They weren't grappling with being in the poorest socioeconomic groups. They weren't grappling with living in the worst neighborhoods, or being in, you know, single parent families because of a legacy of slavery and colonialism. And they didn't face those barriers that we faced. You know, some of them did, admittedly, but not in a more general sense, proportionate to their population demographically. And as a consequence of that, when I came to do my own research, I was forced to go and take my research into the public realm in order to shame my university into funding me, you know. And I did get a scholarship in the end, but trying to get a scholarship and a place at Cambridge with a 2-2 was a challenge, but I did it. You know, purely because of, you know, the fact that my research was considered, you know, seminal research in the international media, not because I was considered, you know, an appropriate scholar that ticked all of those boxes. So I want the widening participation agenda to be made mandatory, so that any doctoral training partnership is required to have widening participation as, you know, a set within their funding structure, to ensure that people who are talented, who are skilled, who do have the ability and the capacity to do the research, but for whatever other reasons, because their starting points, you know, were so much, you know, sort of below the starting points of others, that they get an opportunity to have a level playing field where that's concerned. And it's not all just about the qualification you got, you know, when you were coming through each level of the pipeline, as it were. So that's really the rationale behind why, you know, I went to Dr. Leona Vaughan and said, we need to have this, and we got Fiona Beveridge behind it, and we're here today. So that's the rationale for this whole thing.
Yeah. And what, like, such amazing work. So there's going to be so much for the discussion today. And so if you've already started to get questions, please remember to drop those in the Q&A box. I'm going to be introducing the rest of the panel now. So next on to Paulette Williams, whose work was just referenced obviously by Malik there. Paulette is the founder and managing director at Leading Roots, has worked in higher education for over a decade, leading widening participation and student success projects. She has worked on a range of access projects, including tutoring and mentoring programs in schools, sustained engagement initiatives for students in further education, and most recently, an institution-wide project addressing the BAME awarding gap. Whilst recognizing that the vast majority of the responsibility lies with institutions that need to create more inclusive learning environments, Paulette saw an opportunity to create a network in higher education for the Black community to support students throughout the academic life cycle, deliver activities in partnership with higher education institutions, and encourage students to stay in academia. So welcome, Paulette. I'm going to go through the other introductions first, and then I'm going to give everybody a chance to started to introduce. So next, I'm going to introduce Diya. Dr. Diya Gupta is currently past and present fellow, race, ethnicity and equality in history at the Royal Historical Society and the Institute of Historical Research. She is a literary and cultural historian interested in the intersections between life writing, visual and material culture, and literature, particularly in response to war. Her first book, under contract with Hearst and Oxford University Press, is on an emotional history of India in the Second World War. So welcome, Dr. Diya Gupta. And last but not least, I want to introduce Amatey Doku. Amatey Doku is a consultant at Nous Group, an international consultancy with expertise in higher education. Prior to joining Nous, Amatey was Vice President, Higher Education at the National Union of Students, leading on the organization's international engagement, as well as work to tackle the BAME attainment gap. The later portfolio culminated in the hashtag Closing the Gap report, a collaboration between NUS and Universities UK. Amatey continues to support organizations in health and higher education on equity, diversity, and inclusion, and recently chaired the Do Black Lives Still Matter in Higher Education webinar as part of the Wonky at Home series. So welcome to, am I having a microphone issue? Did everyone catch that, or do I need to do it again? Just keep the papers off the table. Is that what we're saying? Okay, got it. Okay, so introductions done. We're going to crack on with the questions now, and I'm super excited to hear what everybody has to say. So actually, I'm going to turn it back to Malik, actually, and ask if you want to elaborate a bit more on the issues that you've overcome in getting to where you are today.
Well, thank you, Mara. I mean, a lot of people are what we nowadays call care experienced. People who've come through the local authority care system. And when you enter that system, you are essentially persona non grata. Many people who enter that system do not get the formal kind of education that ordinary people get. There's currently a review of social care that's going through the government. And one of the things that I would like to see them doing from a policy standpoint is trying to, develop ways, if you like, that people who are in the care system can actually have their academic side of things nurtured in much the same way as someone who was not in the care system, to give them a level playing field. It's one thing to be deprived of your family and your social structures. It's another thing to be deprived of education on top of that, because that gives you multiple levels of deprivation. And then once you get out of the care system at 18 and they kind of put you on the street, you know, I was put in a hostel for homeless black youths in Post-Riot Toxteth with £100 from social services. And at that point, I'd had 9 years of virtually no education. I was semi-literate. I taught myself to read and write, you know, through doing poetry, and became a poet. And that's how I got myself to college and university, and entered very, very late. So none of that was a reflection of my capacity, my capabilities, my skill set. As you can see from what I'm doing today, I wouldn't be doing a PhD at Cambridge with a full scholarship if I didn't have the ability and the capacity to do that. But what was the failure was the failure of the state education system. The broken pipeline is manifest in me. You know, I am a classic example of that broken pipeline, but most people who go through what I go through wouldn't get to be, you know, in a situation like what I'm in. It's a very privileged position, and that for that reason, I want to use my voice, if you like, on my public platform to try and highlight these issues. And the hope is that, you know, having heard from the panelists here today, that we can have this round table and push this through to policymakers to try and get them to see what can be done by way of reparative justice, because all of this stuff that Black people are facing is rooted in slavery and colonialism and the notion of inherent white supremacy, that we ourselves, you know, somehow inferior and or undeserving of opportunity, or we are somehow the architects of our own, you know, difficulties, and that is because of a lack of understanding as to how we arrived at the position we're in now, which is precisely why I'm studying history.
Amazing. Like, it is incredible to see it laid out, and also so many different facets of the experiences that we talked about, all combined in one person. And I know it's resonating with people in the audience as well. So I want to open up the floor now if anyone else would like to comment on their stories and the things that they've seen, the things that they've seen people overcome. Yes, go for it.
So I wanted to, well, firstly, Mara, thanks so much for introducing all of us. And thank you, Malik, for speaking so eloquently. Like Mara said, it's resonating clearly with people in the audience. Malik, I wondered if you think that one of the issues is also what you were studying. I think you did mention this. So, you know, getting into Cambridge, somewhere like Cambridge, getting a PhD funded is also reflected in what is considered appropriate to be studied at that level. And I wondered if you could reflect a bit more on that. You know, there are certain, I mean, certainly coming from the Royal Historical Society and representing them here, there are obviously certain very conventional modes of what is history and what is considered not to be history. And I wondered if you face those sorts of barriers too.
Well, I didn't just apply to Cambridge. I applied to Lancaster first. Sorry, not Lancaster, UCLan. I applied to UCLan not formally, there was an informal application process through UCLan where they intimated that they were interested in my research, but then the person who had shown an interest left, and they dropped it. And then I went to John Moores University, and I actually have my own archive of my own. I traced my slave ancestry back to a company that owned my ancestors and from whom I'm descended directly. And I acquired an archive of 18th and 19th century documents. And I was literally walking around with my archive going, look, I've got this archive, this is seminal research. Please, can you, consider taking me for a PhD? And when I went to John Moores University, they said, oh, the way we're doing it this year is we're going to do a little synopsis, find a couple of supervisors, and if we find someone who's interested in you, we'll put in a preliminary application. And if they like it, then you can put in, a funded application for AHRC funding. If they don't, then don't bother applying. They came back and they went, don't bother applying. That was John Moores University. So then there was the Manchester University application, where I did the Manchester University application. They had 2 black scholarships for the John Rylands Fellowship. And the John Rylands Scholarship, the Rylands Institute, was specifically around archives. And they wanted to train Black people as archivists because it's one of the most whitest spaces that are out there. So I'm walking in with, 200 folios of archival documents, seminal research in my hand, saying, I'm a Black guy. As an archivist, I want to apply for this. And I applied for both of them and didn't get either of them. Although I did get offered a place at Manchester University, I didn't get any funding. I went to Liverpool University, and the people at Liverpool University were very helpful in helping me to structure my proposal, which I did. I submitted it. They offered me a place, but they didn't have any funding available. So I submitted an application to Cambridge as well. But at the time I submitted the application to Cambridge, my story broke in the BBC. And I had 1.5 million views on my story in 24 hours. And it just went totally viral. Then it was in the Times, it was in the Wall Street Journal, it was in the Daily Mail, it was everywhere. It was on the BBC World Service. So at that point, it kind of switched gears. And the focus was then on me as a public academic, rather than me as, just an applicant with a 2-2. Trying to get funded, when everyone knows that you have to have a first in order to get funded, so it was sort of like the absurdity of how I could do that. Plus the fact that I'm studying history and I've been doing it for 20 years, but I have no qualifications in history. I don't have a GCSE in history. I don't have an A-level in history. I don't have a degree in history. So people are telling me, oh, you can't because you're not a historian. I'm like, but I've been studying this at my own expense, traveling to Guyana, finding the things, buying the archive, doing this stuff, on my own, out of passion, at my own expense for 20 years. How can you tell me it's not valid to be studied? And there's millions of people who are reading about my work, and you don't still consider it to be valid to fund. But yet you're funding, I was looking at some of the stuff that had been funded, and I was thinking, by comparison, it's like, it's not stuff that's going to have any impact, but it's funded because that person ticked those boxes. So then I started thinking, it's the criteria attached to the funding which is keeping us out. Just like the criteria attached to jobs used to keep us out, or the criteria attached to, to income keeps us out of neighborhoods. It's a form of apartheid that's being developed, and it's a residue of that slavery and that colonialist model, which has kept us out of the academy. So it was no surprise to me when Paulette's research came out and just laid it bare. These are statistically the realities in respect to Black people within the academy. What I'm more interested in now is saying, now that we can see that, and we can see it in a clear light of day, and we have examples like my own and some others of what's possible for people who don't necessarily meet that criteria. What are we going to do about changing the criteria to allow that talent and allow that seminal research to emerge and to breathe in the academy? And that's really the objective.
Really, really interesting stuff. And it's definitely making me think about my own experiences in terms of applying. And I definitely had a bit of a heart in boots moment when I was like, okay, I think African traditional religions is the thing. I was like, where am I going to find a home to do that in the UK? Is it even a thing? And there's a lot of conversation around that, not to always make it about what's going on over the pond, but there are a lot more visible scholars over that side. And so that so much of what Malik has said in terms of these barriers, like it definitely resonates with me, and I'm sure some other people. But also, can we just say, like, amazing that you have had, you have had that recognition. And I think sometimes, like Diya was hinting at, there is a bit of myopia in terms of this is what we've got our lenses on, and we can therefore only see certain kinds of things. And actually it takes the wider conversation outside of an institution to be like, actually, yeah, we think that's really interesting. And my background being businesses is something you see in the business world as well. No one wants to do anything about X until actually they realize that all of their customers care about it. And so I wonder if anyone else would like to touch on, how they got to where they are today, and whether they feel like they've overcome any of this kind of myopia. I think, Paulette, I'd be interested in knowing from you what it's been like banging on doors and being like, hey, these are the issues that I can see. Obviously, there's a lot of reports now, and I think that this is something that I've noticed too. Until you've got a report about it, everyone's like, oh, is it an issue? And I'm like, I'm telling you it's an issue. So yes, it is. And outside of, before I became into academia, I was like, why is everyone writing reports all the time? Like, surely they've got a lot of other things to do. And now I get it. Until you can put some numbers behind things, it people are like, oh, it's almost invisible. So I'd love to hear from you, Paulette, on that as well.
Yeah, sure. I think it's quite interesting actually, because often there are a lot of reports, even in higher education, and still no one does anything. We all know about how many reports are constantly being produced and nothing happens. So I am still quite surprised that the report that I co-authored with Jason and Chantel and Suki has had such a response. Like, people have taken notice, because honestly, apart from that statistic, which Chantel did a freedom of information request to get, there's nothing new in that report. There's not, like, I have to say, like, it's great that people listen, but there's nothing new. So maybe it was just a case of timing and just luck that people really listened to what we were saying, and I'm glad that they have. But yeah, your original question about, like, sort of personal kind of challenges as well. For me, I think I'm on the professional services side of things. So I also work at UCL full time, as you mentioned in my bio, as well as running Leading Roots, right? So in my job, I'm in professional services. I'm not on the academic side of things, and the same issues are still there, but often people forget about professional services in these conversations. And for me, I had worked in WP for a really, really long time, and I was frustrated, I think, yes, by like what was happening in terms of our community and the stats and stuff, but also for my own career, like I wasn't really getting any opportunities to move up or do new things. So I think for me, like, starting Leading Roots was probably a little bit about that as well. Like, how can I break free of this kind of, I want to stay in higher education. I value education. I think it's really, really important. But how do I break free? And so, yeah, one of the things that I did was to start Leading Roots, where I now have new skills that I can talk about, new experiences that I can talk about. And I know not everyone can do that, but that's just kind of, yeah, what I chose to do.
Fascinating. And as someone who's benefited from Leading Roots work and spaces, I really, back in the before times when everything was in person, I was lost in a building trying to find the room a number of times. But it was a real massive benefit. And I think even things like being on campuses and navigating uni, then it means that the first time you're doing it isn't the real time. You're getting a chance to kind of be lost and clueless before you're going to be lost and clueless for the real. So I do think that's really interesting. And you've touched on something that I am, what the House of Sweetwater's mission is, encouraging people to start businesses out of that thing, because that thing that you've kind of struggled through, that most people are like, oh, you kind of think about it a lot, that's actually something that other people will be struggling with, and you building into that and treating it as something that can propel you forward, and creating and using your knowledge to support others is such a worthwhile thing, because you got the cards to say it. So
yeah, literally, when people ask me who is the audience for Leading Roots, I'm like, me. Me, like 10 years ago, and also me like now, you know, like, so yeah, I think it's important that we stay kind of at the center of our work, and, you know, we're addressing issues that we know are important to people like us as well.
Exactly. And so, Amatey, I know you have some experience also on the professional services side. So I wonder if any of this are you seeing things mirrored here as well, or?
I think my perspective on this has been, so yeah, I don't work in academia. I work for a consulting firm, and we work primarily with universities. But I think it's really interesting, particularly hearing Malik, your story. And I think I was with many of you, obviously Paulette will know, but many of you know Jason Arde. And I was in a session with him at university where he was talking about privilege. And he did that. Some of you may know this exercise where you line up the whole room and you step forward or step back based on the amount of privilege that you have. And I slightly ruined his exercise because it got to the point where actually I was quite far ahead as far as privilege was concerned relative to other people, and having, you know, a black guy, one of the few black people in the room, slightly ruined his exercise. But you know, we had a bit of a joke about it. But on a serious point, one of the things that I've come to realize quite acutely going through the education system and get to the end is the amount of privilege that I've had through that system is how much as well it's an exception rather than the rule. And all the stuff Malik was talking about around you know, this, in the sense, this sort of myth about it being a meritocracy, I can just look back and see, you know, it is an absolute myth. And this idea that all you have to do is, you know, work really hard and you'll make it, and with no account of all the barriers that took place. So when I went to Cambridge as an undergraduate, I remember even at that age I recognized it as well. I got my offer and got in, and everyone was like really surprised and very, you know, pleased, and obviously, you know, it was a big deal. And part of me was obviously very pleased to get in, but I'd also thought, well, to an extent, I felt like I had a lot of things stacked in my favor. I was third generation to go to university on both sides. Turns out, I didn't realize that until later. But my granddad had done a master's in Cambridge in the 50s. So there was always expectation that I'd go to university. Went to an independent school, family, you know, middle class family background, you know, was, you know, nurtured academically, but also in terms of extracurricular, played musical instruments, got, you know, it's a very, very comfortable kind of growing up. What was really interesting though is that by the time I got to sixth form and final year, our school was fairly diverse when you got to year 7. By the time you got to year 13, there were no black people. That was one of the few. And then you get into Cambridge, and as an undergraduate in Cambridge, you look around, you're like, literally nobody else here who looks like you. However, partly because of that, a sort of a bizarre result of that was that I'd learned how to operate in majority white middle class spaces. So I could navigate. I knew how to speak. I knew how to engage with those, with people like that. I'd done a lot of, you know, I did a lot of choral music. Anybody who knows anything about the British choral music scene, very, very white, very, very privileged. I'd been immersed in that, so I knew my way around those spaces. And I got a real wake up call when I was president of the college student union, and we were organizing Freshers Week. And this black fresher comes up to me, you know, day one, and she's just in tears, and she says, I can't cope with this. Like, I want to change colleges. I don't feel comfortable here. She said, everybody knows each other. I feel really left out. And the reality was, nobody knew each other, but because of the way they were talking, and because of, you know, everyone is basically incredibly insecure at that point, but because of the way everybody's talking, they had a common language. And she was from an inner city, a state school in Croydon, no reference points whatsoever to all the sorts of things these people were talking about, and felt really acutely left out. And it was just an interesting thing for me, recognizing that because of my privilege and education, I'd learned how to operate in those spaces. Most, you know, black people going into those spaces don't have that. And I mean, I could talk about this for a long time, but I think one of and then the other thing that happens in my position is that you then become the only and the first in a lot of different spaces, and you become in some cases that token that people feel comfortable with, because lots and so many comments of, oh no, I don't see you as black, I just see you as you, and that kind of thing. And it's really uncomfortable kind of language, but effectively what they're saying is that, oh, you're not like the other black people, you're different. Like, we can deal with you, you're palatable, but everybody else, we don't have to kind of deal with that. So there's a lot of that, and I think for me, I've just always been acutely aware that I'm the exception, and I just think that is not, we cannot have that level of hierarchy in our higher education system. We can't expect, there are some people who think, oh, what we need to do is just get more people to understand the rules of the game, and we just need to get more people to into Oxbridge, or we just need to get people in to have that privilege, rather than actually challenging the exclusionary nature of those spaces and trying to break that down. I think that's the key to solving this. Otherwise, it will just morph and change, and other ways of exclusion will continue to perpetuate. But anyway, that's a bit about kind of my background there. So I'd say overall, it's been relatively comfortable, but I recognize that's come down to quite a lot of privilege.
No, and thank you so much for sharing that, because I think it's also really important to like for it to be highlighted that the Black experience is really varied. And as someone who comes in, in between, I also have had some experiences where where I've recognized my privilege in certain ways, and also like being a master's research level student and getting to chair a panel with all of you. If I wasn't privileged before, I'm definitely racking that up now, because these are also the other kinds of credentials that people care about. So it is a really nuanced conversation. And I know people in the audience are already kind of being like, well, you make it looks good on you, which I think is also an exceptionally like the ability for marginalized people to make the most wild experiences look, or like to weather them well, like Malik could have a serious amount more gray hairs and a whole load of other things going on for the things that you've been through. And so I think it's interesting to note that even across the myriad experiences, even with privilege, there are still things going on, because, for example, that other student who came to you, they came to you. So even if you're not bearing it, as a community where there's always some thread, being pulled. And it's not every day that you wake up and you've got the capacity to be a champion for the entire community. Like, sometimes you just need to remember to water and feed yourself and your plants and your children, and then get back to bed and get some rest. So really, really appreciate all of that there. So I think the next question I'd love to ask then is, what are we pointing to next in the future? Like, how can we make sure that either there isn't a next time round in a symposium where we're talking about barriers for people, or that by that time we've at least got a whole new set of barriers to discuss and we're not discussing the same ones. And I know that funding is something that has come up really vitally in that as well. I'm a girl with loans, I tell you. The student loan company is, they've got my details, they know how to find me. So it would be really interesting to know, like, what in your experiences or in your thoughts, what should we be focusing on now when we do have that capacity? And especially for those of us in the audience who are either coming up or in a position to break these barriers down for people, like there are going to be opportunities for people, even in one-on-one situations, to make life easier for other people. So what do you think we should all be focusing on? And I'm going to field that. Who wants to take that first? Or I'm going to do like a little tickety. I feel like if someone wants to maybe start on funding, that would be interesting, but you're all just smiling at me looking cute. Okay, we'll go with Diya first, and then back to Malik and whoever else. Great.
I'm always happy to start it off, Mara, no problem there. So really fascinating discussion so far. And thanks for raising the very thorny issue of funding. I think, Malik, you brought that up as well when you talked about your own experiences there. So speaking from the Royal Historical Society's perspective, and in particular, the Race, Ethnicity and Equality Working Group, who I represent and who I sit on, that's a marker of privilege as well. One of the things we're realizing increasingly is that how institutions can make interventions that will really enable people of color to enter into those very exclusive academic spaces. And I think Amatey touched on that, feel included and able to continue in those spaces. So one of the things we're trying to do is to demystify some of the narratives around academia. And one of the projects we have ongoing at the moment is precisely that, to do with funding. So we're trying to produce what we're calling a pipeline document, quoting Paulette's own work, which shows people of color, okay, I've done my undergraduate. How can I then get on to do a master's? What are the funding opportunities there for me if I want to do a master's? Or for somebody who's finished their master's program, okay, how does one do this PhD business? How does one even begin applying for it? How does one, even start looking for a PhD supervisor? Again, what sort of funding routes are there? How early should I apply? So we're trying to lay this out in as clear and understandable and as visual a manner as possible. And so watch this space. It's going to turn up in the next 3 to 4 months. And that's something we're very aware is a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I mean, it's something I've started having conversations about with, but if you ask me if I was confident on a scale of 1 to 10, how confident am I that I'm going to get my PhD funded? I know I will, because there's no other way. It has to happen. But why is that always the way that we have to approach these things, right? And also the weight that it takes, the time that it takes, and the energy that it takes to go about things that way, by hook or by crook, when actually there are, there can be PDFs and there can be guides, and there are places where this information is freely available. So why not make that more inclusive? I wonder, and I think especially as funders, it's interesting to see, like, hopefully they'll also be taking notice of, I guess Malik's experience and other people's experience as well, which is that there is a bubble, right, that doesn't speak to what's interesting or exciting or makes good research in the wider space. Malik, let's hear from you on that.
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much, Diya, for raising some of those issues, and it's great to see that your society is working on some initiatives around that. And it would be really great to have your input when we get to the stage of doing the round table, because what we're looking for at the round table is for policymakers and funding organisations to provide some input into strategic kind of recommendations that we can then try and feed up into policymaking fora. So that's something really important. One of the other things I think that's really needs to be considered is some of the structural stuff along the way. For instance, the use of the term BAME. So this was something that when you look at Black and minority ethnic, you look at a place like Oxford or Cambridge and you see, or other Russell Group universities, you see that the BAME statistic is sort of, on parity with the demographic within the country. But then when you break the BAME certificate down, the Black element of it is really, really small, because there's, a disproportionate representation, for instance, South Asians and so on and so forth, who fall within that category. So there's the whole debate about taking the B out of BAME, to be able to, really drill down into the figures a little bit more. And I think also what we need to consider is the ability of people who are first generation to university, which in the Black community, that is more common than we might imagine. And obviously, Amatey's given us a clear distinction that's not always the case, and we recognize that. In the case of my children are all in private schools, and they'll be second generation, so they will enjoy the similar privilege to what Amatey has enjoyed. But that doesn't take away the broken pipeline, as it were, as Paulette's identified, because that's still there for the majority of people. And as Amatey quite rightfully said, he's the exception rather than the rule. And the reason I'm putting my kids in private school is not because I want to just pay for their education. It's because I need to subvert the pipeline. I need to subvert that process. In the area where I live, the nearest school to me is in special measures. My son would have automatically gone into that just because he's in the catchment area. The only way for me not to get my black son into this school that's in special measures is to pay for him to go to Merchant Taylors. You know, and the same with my daughter. So I'm doing that because I know that that's the privilege within the system. I'm doing it because I have to. I don't like having to pay for something that should be free. There are good state schools, but we are not being able to access them good state schools because they're in such high demand. And then there's other things. I'm a Muslim, so therefore the majority of the best state schools in Liverpool, for instance, are Christian schools. So if you're not a Catholic, you can't go in them. They take Catholics first, then they take Christians of other denominations, and then if they have other religions, everyone, Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Jews, they're all bagged into one. So, you know, and they've got a small percentage of it for other faiths and no positions for people of no faith. So, you know, depending on where you are on that scale of your sort of, you know, whether you have immigrant status, whether you're black, whether you've got a different religious, you know, state beyond Christianity, or you have no religion, these are other variables now which play into that when you're trying to get into the school system, that will feed into your Russell Group universities, that will then feed the early career, you know, professionals, you know, academics, which will then feed the academy. So when Amatey went into Cambridge, he didn't see black professors because there are none. You know, that's why that girl came to him, because he was the one who was already there that she could see. What we need to do is we need to have those black professors in all these universities, you know, and Paulette's, you know, report has identified that. I mean, you got less than 5 black British professors, like rounded down to 0. You know, you know, this is absurd in the times that we live in. It's not reflective of the demographic in the country. I would just like to say I don't have a place to plug in here, and my battery is on about 2%. And it may go off, and if it does, it's not that I don't love you guys, I actually do. But I would just, because I'm in transit, I would just ask to be excused, and I will be available on other panels if people want to send messages to me. So if the battery goes, that's the reason, but I'm going to stay for as long as I possibly can.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. We were going to have to release Malik early anyway to get on with promoting the launch of books and also wrapping up with a PhD Viva or some big session with that.
In my first year, I literally stopped in another motorway cafe.
Oh, right.
My first year external assessment, like a mini Viva.
Oh, I sure.
And I'm pleased to say I passed. So yes, I'm now switching to a PhD candidate at 3 o'clock this afternoon. Also on my way back from Birmingham. So I've been doing quite a lot on my way back from Birmingham today. But
I mean, as someone who's in Birmingham right now, I'm just going to say toot toot for all of that. I think it also is. This is something that hadn't quite come up as well. Even if you have, well, I guess we did touch on this, but even with certain amounts of privilege, right? Even at Cambridge, there are other burdens that Black and other students have to bear that are otherwise invisible. And sometimes it's working, sometimes it's financial, but it's also sometimes family, other issues like that, events, having to navigate a more structured life. If you have less access to economic resources, maybe you don't drive, all these different things play into it. So it really is a case of, especially if you are in charge of stewarding students, and like, not to say that academics and lecturers don't have much on their plate. We know what's going on in Liverpool at the moment, and I see in particular how hard my supervisors are working. But what is really great is that they treat me as an individual case, and so there is a lot of room for me to say what's going on with me and what I need or what's happening at that time. And I think that where it's like a really basic place where that's get lost is just treating people all as equal. And I've heard from a lot of other students who have been like, someone died and they wouldn't let me do this, or I'm working a full-time job, and all of our other, you know, we're all doing exams online. So I asked if I could just shift the window, which is digitally accessible, and they got a no. And it's like these fundamental things that even the students can see, like, if this 2% shift would make it easier for me, they're literally asking and putting these solutions at people's feet and being like, can you do it? And people are saying no for reasons that, you know, I don't really think cut it in that circumstance. Paulette, you look like you want to go on that.
Yeah, because it kind of leads into one of the points I wanted to make. So your question was around sort of what barriers do you see in the future? And I think one of the barriers that I can see, like, is there being a growing sort of fatigue around this sort of the race work in higher education, because I've just come back from maternity leave, but just before I left was just kind of, just before I left was just as the pandemic kind of started, and you could see like how quickly things were changing, and like people were responding really quickly, and it was great. And then, so I don't know, in my head, I kind of thought, well, this is a good sign. Like maybe when I get back, things would have moved along a bit. And actually I've come back and I'm seeing that it's not really happening, you know? So the change that I thought might have been possible in terms of people learning to be more flexible, learning to be more open to new ways of doing things, particularly in relation to race equity, it's just still, it's not there. And it's now probably, I would say, potentially worse because they have the kind of, let's say excuse, but reason of prioritizing anything related to the pandemic, right? So you want to ask for something and you can't really argue with that. If someone says no, because, you know, we've got to respond to this, you can't, it's hard to argue with that because we've all been through this collectively and we know how challenging it's been. So that was definitely one of the things that I wanted to say around what barriers might be there in the future. I also think the impact of the pandemic, there have actually been some positive changes. I know for some institutions, I can speak for UCL, there's been a report that the awarding gap closed because there were so many changes to teaching and assessment, which was great. But I think one of the barriers could be that there's then like this false sense of change. Maybe people might relax a little bit, or maybe people might, again, not pay attention to what has changed and why it changed and just kind of go back to what it was. And the final thing was around something that Chantel, my friend Chantel, who works at Leading Roots, always talks about, which is that a lot of Black academics increasingly seem to not want to stay in academia. So despite getting a PhD, don't really want to be in this space. And we just recently did a career series, and one of the workshops was around alternative careers. And it was probably one of our most popular out of the four because people are looking for other avenues to use their PhD, to use their skills in environments that are just not as toxic. So I think these are some of the things that we have to kind of be aware of in the next few years, I think.
That resonates so hard with me because I remember like people were like, oh, you can be a professor and da 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 da. And I was like, why would I want to do this? And it was particularly, there was a large, what was it called? The Monticello Society came to Liverpool, and there was a few very high profile Black UK professors, I think, speaking. And it was on social media afterwards that I don't think she even got travel expenses. And listen, if you get all the way to that stage and someone wants you to come across the country and they won't pay you to come, and if she's not getting paid, that means that I've got another 30 years in this career at least before I'm even asking about. Do you know what I mean? What does that say? What does that say to people up and coming if at that big stage? It's the equivalent of being like Bill Gates in the academic world and not getting paid for your time and your expertise. And they came anyway because they didn't want to miss an opportunity to network and they didn't want to deprive people of it. But it's like if that is so basic, you know, and this is things, you know, like let's look at the budgets, right? If you can't afford, like in business, if you can't afford to pay people, you shouldn't really be asking them to be there. You've got work to do, you know? And so that really, really hit hard with me. And then Amatey, I feel like you wanted to jump in on that as well.
No, I was just going to say that I think there are two aspects to this as well. One is obviously fixing the pipeline with the sort of current, you know, I mean, how far back do you need to even go? But let's say for the sake of argument, current undergraduates, are they seeing, you know, academia as a route for them and all the interventions you need to do to support them, given challenges with the attainment gap and how that will disadvantage them as they go forward? Okay, so let's say overnight, we had a magic wand and we managed to fix all of that today. even then, we're not going to see the dividends of that for the next 20 years. So that I don't think there's really been enough conversation about the fact that fixing that stage of the pipeline is important. But in the meantime, we need to be thinking about the complete opposite of what Paulette's talking about. So not even retaining the Black staff or the other staff of color that we've got, but how we actually getting more people who are actually in other industries to come into academia and see that as a place for them. Because unless we do that, we're not going to see any effects. Even if we manage to improve the start of the pipeline, great. We're not going to see any effects for the next 20 years. So that is also a conversation. And I just saw, so at the college I was at Jesus College in Cambridge, and we've just got, I think she's the first Black woman master of an Oxbridge college.
Sunita Elaine.
Yeah, Sunita Elaine. Now, obviously, representation isn't everything, but it's been so interesting seeing what she's been able to do in the time that she's been there. And they just released an infographic of the new visiting lecturers, visiting fellows at the college, and the majority of people on that were not white. And that for me just really stood out. I was like, okay. And instantly I thought that's definitely, there is absolutely no way that it didn't come from her insistence, because there are no other sort of fellows of color really at the college. So that is the kind of thing that you need to be thinking about. How do we correct the challenge? And it goes to the retention point. If we're not getting serious about retaining that staff, you know, we're really not going to make progress. And it comes down to leadership. It comes down to leadership priorities. I think there is a thing of, while the current picture does look pretty, at sometimes quite despairing, there is a shift in broader society, particularly with the younger generations coming in, going into the workforce, are much more opinionated. They're not taking you know, things lying down as maybe previous generations did, as, you know, kind of suffering. But yeah, there's a huge job for the sector to do. It's going to look like a very different sector if when we get this right. And I think we need to be alive to kind of the scale of the transformation needed.
Absolutely. And I think that timescales thing is really interesting too. And I think it's really vivid how it's come up that there are different options here, right? And that people also need to look at what their wheelhouse is. And I get a lot of questions from people who are like, okay, well, how do I be better? And then I'm always fielding it back to them. It's not about, okay, it's not about necessarily even going to what the blueprint is. Like, let's look at where your locus of interest is. Let's look at where your locus of concern is and start there. I know now, Amatey, I can hit you up to come to some of the universities that I'm working with and to talk about what you're doing. Great. You know, like that doesn't mean that necessarily some of the things that Paulette's doing or going to be advocating for are going to be the best place for me to step in. Not necessarily, but if you are asking yourself now, okay, well, how do I help? I think the question is, well, what's the next thing that you're going to do anyway? And how do you make that better or fairer or more equitable? And even if that means that the next thing you ask a question about the next thing you're going to do, I'm going to be writing my reading list, or I'm going to be sending an email to so-and-so, or I'm going to be looking at the budget or something. It doesn't mean that you have to get it perfect that time, but you have to start asking the questions. And there's a lot of people here on this panel. There's a lot of different avenues where you can go to start asking those questions if there isn't anyone in your immediate vicinity who can help, because it's also sometimes the people who we have access to ask those questions aren't always the best people. And I know I've been fielded questions where, and having had, you know, the business background and a great understanding through that of understanding the value of my time, I will be like, yeah, you know, that's a really interesting conversation. You can field that through House of Sweet Waters, and here's what my rates start at. Whereas I know a lot of scholars as well who are putting in work for departments that are barely going to acknowledge them. They're the go-to just because they're the only person of color or the only Black person there. And so they're getting fielded all these questions. How do we fix this? How do we fix that? And it's not their job. They're just trying to do their degree. They're not experts in it either. So it's not then their fault. Like, why are we always putting it to those people too? And are they getting the kudos that they deserve? And so thank you again to everyone for attending, for the questions, for putting your energy in. It sounds like there is a really, really awesome, very interesting audience here. So please do be getting in touch with people, do be clicking on those LinkedIn links and stuff like that. You don't know what's going to come from it. So I do want to see a lot of connections. And yeah, I think just to wrap up, I am going to love this in capitals as well. I like that. I'm here for that. Capitals. Okay. And so just to wrap up by saying there will be a recording. It will be slightly edited, but there will be a recording of this made available, and we will try and get as many of the links as possible out to all of you after this. And it is important to note that there are some future events upcoming. So on the 13th of September, please join Telling Our Own Story, Research Methods and Approaches Within Communities, and the Academy, which Centre Black Voices in Slavery Research. On the 20th of September, there is Universities and Reparative Justice. What could this look like? You can sign up to the CSIS mailing list on the website, liverpool.ac.uk/CSIS. I put my piece of paper on the microphone again, but are we all right? Okay, cool. And yes, I'm so bad. I told everyone I never put my links in. But yes, I am houseofsweetwaters.co.uk. You can also find me on my personal Instagram @_Mara Elizabeth. I'm not on Twitter because I just don't understand how people stay on top of anything that happens there. I get really stressed every time I open it. But yeah, my pinned tweet is find me on Instagram. But it would be great to see as many of you as possible at these upcoming events. Do check out the keynote as well by Sir Professor Hilary Beckles if you haven't done that already. And please also do look out for the report that will be coming out in the 25th of March 2022. This is the roundtable, sorry. So please do look out for the roundtable, Lifting the Barriers to UK Black Academia, which you have all fed into today with your thoughts, comments, questions, and notes. So big round of applause to our panel, and virtual round of applause to Malik, who is hopefully safely on their way to the next event. And that is it, everybody. Thank you so much, and see you all at one of the following events.